Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. Hot off the presses is the first edition of Changemaker Wellbeing Indexed, published by Future of Good in partnership with Environics Research. The 2025 Changemaker Wellbeing Index is the most comprehensive and representative research on the well-being of nonprofit workers ever conducted in Canada. The index will be updated annually over the next decade, providing changemakers with the high-quality data, research, and analysis they need to address the well-being inequities nonprofit workers and leaders have long grappled with. To help us get an understanding of the key findings of the 2025 index, please welcome Anouk Bertner, Executive Director of Future of Good. Anouk co-leads Future of Good with the CEO and offers executive direction to day-to-day management, business performance, program and partnership strategies, talent, culture, and operations. Anouk's leadership also led to some of Future of Good's signature learning programming, including the 2023 Social Finance Forum and the 2023 Black Leadership in Social Impact Summit, and the important initiative that we're here to talk about today. Welcome to the podcast, Anouk.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's dive right into the results of the recent Future of Good Changemaker Wellbeing Index. The report reveals that only 33% of nonprofit workers are thriving, while 36% have poor well-being. Can you walk us through what's driving that gap? What does this indicate about the state of well-being in the sector today?
Absolutely. So just to break that down a bit further, we have a third that are thriving, as you mentioned. We have a third that are managing, and then we have a third that are either struggling or severely struggling. And what this shows us is that it's not just anecdotal evidence. It's not just a few folks or a few organizations that are really struggling. There is a large number of people. And one of the things that's really interesting with this work is that it is a representative sample. So we looked at all nonprofit workers. So there are some folks who work in governmental nonprofits, and they tended to be higher in the well-being spectrum. And we really found that those that worked at community nonprofits tended to be lower down in terms of their well-being and be more likely to be in the struggling group.
That is alarming. One of the most striking findings that I thought was astounding is that 31% of nonprofit workers experience food insecurity, and this rises to 34% of nonprofit employees working in community nonprofits. What does this say about the economic model of the sector, and what needs to happen to change this alarming trend?
Yes, this is something that we really did not expect. We saw this in the early data, and we thought that it would even out because oftentimes when one collects data, we get the first few responses, and it's hard to draw conclusions from that. You need the full samples to be statistically significant. But we really saw this holding through. And then when you look at entry-level workers, this actually increases to 50% of folks. And this is just really an unacceptable situation. People who are doing important work and who are working full time should not be food insecure. And I think what it really reflects is that we know we have an affordability crisis. We know that housing has gotten more expensive. We know that food has gotten more expensive. And because of that, and because of the inflation that accompanies it, everything has gotten more expensive. And if wages do not increase at the same pace, then they collide. And I think what we're seeing is that for especially entry-level workers and the lowest paid workers in organizations, they are really just in the crux of this right now, and they are really, really struggling. And that's what's contributing to that food insecurity.
And the 50% that you spoke to about, are they often on the front lines? That's my understanding, or at least what I intuited from the research. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
So these are the folks that are directly offering the services to people who need them most in our communities.
Absolutely. So, in addition to the data, we did some journalism around this, and we interviewed some folks who either worked at food banks or had retired from food banks. And it's really a shocking situation when somebody works at a food bank and then has to use that food bank, or has worked a portion of their career and then retired from a food bank and then needs to go back there in retirement. So, it's really just a pretty crazy situation. And I think, again, this is the value of having data. We know now that this is not an isolated circumstance, and we have some data around it so that when we do the same work next year, we can see whether this problem is getting worse or whether it's getting better.
Yeah, it's really heartbreaking to think of these people who give so much of themselves in their careers working on the front lines, who also are basically end up in circumstances where they become the very communities that they were helping to work to alleviate their suffering. It's just astounding to me.
I think so too. um, I think there's some good news in this study also. I don't want to paint it all as very bleak, but this is definitely a bleak piece of data. And I think, what we do with bleak pieces of data is we change the system. We say that this is unacceptable and we choose to do something about it.
The report also indicates that half of the workers in the lowest income bracket report poor well-being. Can you talk about this correlation between well-being and income? I mean, obviously they're connected, but also including how it plays out in the sector and what organizations and funders could be doing to pay a more livable salary to the people that work for them.
Mm-hmm. So this is something that we saw very strongly, that income is correlated to well-being. And I think this makes a lot of sense. I think if somebody is concerned about survival, because, if we're talking about housing security and food, we really are talking about survival. These are not discretionary items. Then it's very hard to have any good well-being. And, I sort of see this as a bit of a bulldozer effect where, if somebody is really struggling with their financial survival, they're not thinking about their mental health. They're not thinking about their physical health. They're not able to support their kids if their kids have special needs, or even, just regular things like soccer practice and dental work. So, it's really this one bulldozer element that then affects this whole host of other issues.
Well, younger workers and those in the entry level roles that you talked about, and those, I guess, that are on the front line, are significantly more likely to report well being, as you've mentioned. What implications does that have for leadership pipelines for talent and long term sector sustainability?
Absolutely huge. Every sector, every workplace needs bright young people and bright people to work on big systemic issues. We know that the issues that we face are significant, and a lot of them are worsening, and they're also becoming more interrelated. So we're seeing how climate change affects housing. Right now in Canada, we have forest fires, across the country. And what that does is people have to evacuate from their homes, and then they're moving to other communities, and they suddenly need housing. So, as we see these sort of crises intermingling, that's going to take a lot of energy and new thinking and problem solving to figure that out. And if we don't have that next generation of bright young people who want to take on these roles and see themselves in the sector, not just this year, but really building a career in this space, then that creates a lot of problems, a lot of problems for nonprofits. So I hope this is really a warning call to a lot of folks. And you mentioned about living wages. So I think this is something that funders especially can do, is ask fundees, when they're doing the grant application, there's many questions on the grant application. Are you paying a living wage? And if not, why? Because I think there are legitimate reasons why it might be difficult to pay a living wage. But I think that is a nuanced, interesting conversation to have between a funder and a fundee. And I think individuals can do this too. Anybody who is contributing to the nonprofit sector, ask this question: are you paying a living wage? Because folks who are working in these spaces really deserve, living wages also.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's hard for any employer in this context, but especially in the nonprofit sector where budgets are so much lower, to keep track of the drop in cost or the rising cost of living and how that relates to the wages that they're paying. That's not something you can necessarily budget for. I mean, especially in circumstances where we're dealing with U.S. imposed tariffs and other sort of economic impacts that are really impacting the quality and the health of our economy.
Absolutely. And I think, this is not an easy issue to solve. I don't think any employer, any nonprofit anywhere wants to pay a sub living wage. I don't think that's a choice that they make. I think it is something that really comes out of desperation and comes out of those tight budgets. But I think there's a piece here around, we oftentimes talk about business models, of any type of organization. Like, how do we operate so that our costs are less than our revenues, so that at the end of the year, we're not overdrawn. And I think there's really an issue with nonprofits here because there is a rising need for the services that they are providing, and then there is a decreasing pool of resources that's available to support that. So, when you look at those two, sort of lines coming together, like that is showing us that not only are we experiencing some of that right now, but we're going to continue to experience it. So I think it's more than, a budgeting exercise. I think this is really an overhaul of how we do a lot of this work.
I couldn't agree more. It's I guess this report may well be the canary in the coal mine that really is auguring some real problems that we have that are systemic in nature.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think, one of the other ways that we really hope that this report is used is by policymakers. So, a lot of the issues that we see issues that, whether it's a food bank, whether it's a tutoring service, different types of community nonprofits are dealing with are oftentimes the result of poor policy. And I think if we can fix some of those upstream issues around poor policy and we build food security into our overall community planning, then we don't even need to deal with this. Like, food banks were never meant to be a permanent solution. And most nonprofits that I know, they eventually want to go out of business. They want the problems that they work on to be solved. So I think that should be that should always be foremost in our minds. So it's not just about improving working conditions. I think that's definitely part of what we need to do. But there's also this bigger piece about preventing and ameliorating overall conditions.
I wanted to also address another finding that the report indicated, and this is about burnout. It's hardly surprising after going through a pandemic and the fallout of all of that and increased demand on social services and on the nonprofit sector. Burnout, though, was reported by 34% of nonprofit workers, especially among those in social service roles. How is this impacting quality of work, staff and staff retention, and even client safety? I wonder if you had any insights into that.
That's not part of the study, so I can't comment on that directly. But I think burnout occurs in a lot of different ways. And I think it's an issue far beyond the nonprofit sector. I think there are a lot of folks who are struggling with this. And I think there are parts of this that are happening at work, and they have to do with well-being and being able to take care of yourself. But the world is a hard place to be in right now. We have, the existential threat of climate change. And, now we have an additional existential threat of a neighbor who is trying to annex us and bring us under their authoritarian regime. So it's really hard to just read the news and participate in community and not feel that. So I sort of think of, like the James Bond scene where all of the walls are sort of like coming in. And I think what we need to do as change makers is figure out, what are the levers that we can control. We can work on climate change, but we can't fix it immediately. We can work on this issue with the U.S., but none of us individually can fix it. So, what are the parts that we can change? And I think a lot of that comes down to the local level. And this is one of the things that I absolutely love about community nonprofits and anybody who works hyper locally is that you can control what is happening in your community. You can control how you treat your employees, how you treat your volunteers, and how you create that space. So I think that is sort of within the locus of our control.
Well, since you've raised community nonprofit workers, you also had a finding that is also very distressing, that nearly half of community nonprofit workers are considering leaving their jobs, with social services leading the way. What's at risk if this trend continues, and what needs to change in how we support frontline talent?
I think that is very multi-factored. One of the findings that was really interesting and that I thought was so neat from this report is they do something called an employment NPS. So, would you recommend your workplace to someone else? And one of the factors that significantly improved it was having formal HR practices in place. So this is things like having a performance review process, an annual performance review process, having a pay grid so that people know which, within, if they do a certain role, like what is the pay range. And these might seem like small things, but I think what they do is they give people control over their own situation. So they suddenly understand the larger financial picture in which they are living in and they are working in. So I think that is actually something that employers can do. And I think oftentimes it falls to the back because the frontline work is so important. But I think what this is revealing is that that type of administration and transparency is actually really important because it signals to employees that they matter and that they are worth putting in that administrative effort, and then they get that benefit out of it.
That's really an interesting insight. Thank you. I wanted to move to another finding that is more positive in nature. The report shows that 93% of workers feel their work has a meaningful impact. But unfortunately, that doesn't always translate them into feeling supported, secure, or that they've got good well-being. How do we reconcile this emotional commitment with the burnout and the financial strain that also show up in the report? What's the relationship between job satisfaction and burnout, and this feeling that we know that so many people in the nonprofit sector share, is this sense of wanting to have impact and feeling that they're making meaningful impact?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we actually, I think this was a title in one of the sections because we found it so significant. So this is really about the passion that people bring to their work, how they know that their work is important because they see how it is affecting the community and how essential it is. But at the end of the day, they need to pay their bills. They need to know that they have housing security. They need to know that they can purchase food. And, these are really basic things, but also just all the discretionary things that make life worth living and a little bit more lovely. So I think it's not about one or the other. It's really about exploring that tension. And from, in talking to our researcher, Stephen Eyre, he was saying that anecdotally in the past, before we've really seen this current affordability crisis, there used to be a bit of a halo effect around nonprofits. And that was really related to that passion and meaning piece that you just mentioned, because this really does increase people's loyalty to their work and how they perceive how it fits into their life. But I think what we're seeing is that people are at the breaking point. So being forced into making these choices about thinking about leaving because they can't afford it.
Yeah, and that's a very difficult choice for people to make who find such meaning in the work that they do, but can't make ends meet in their own finances and in their own lives. It's certainly a loss for them to leave, but it's obviously a loss for the nonprofit sector and the organizations that their work supports, and quite a crisis if that should continue.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is, we try and always look at the positive aspects of this and how we can support the nonprofit sector. One of the things that I found in this personally after reading it is, in looking at the data, it shows that nonprofit workers who are in the higher pay scale are more likely to have had a raise in the last year. And that really surprised me because a raise is usually percentage based. And on the highest salaries, that's actually going to cost more. So I think, looking into that, what that shows me is that there's a huge opportunity to look at young workers and not see them as disposable and really think about how to support them. So there is a financial piece to it about, cost of living increases annually. There's also a piece here around mentorship and autonomy and mastery of their work. But I think what it's indicating to me is that we really need to be thinking about younger workers because they're really struggling right now.
Absolutely. I wanted to move to another aspect of the report, and it says that support for DEI is broad across the sector, but relatively tepid, particularly among those with lower income or job dissatisfaction. What can be done to deepen this support and make DEI feel more relevant to those who are struggling most?
It's an interesting question. I think the response was tepid, but it was there was very little um, direct resistance to it. And I do think that is an important distinction. And I think, one of the things that's really important to do with any type of data product is to triangulate between this and other products that we've seen. And I know Benevity has recently rolled out their giving report. And in there, they show that there have not actually been a lot of significant rollbacks on DEI funding. So it might have shifted in terms of departments. But what they are seeing is that it is going to employee resource groups, and there is still a commitment in a lot of organizations. And I was chatting with someone yesterday, and we were talking about the anti-DEI backlash. And he mentioned to me that, in some ways he's not worried about it because it's just taking the dead fish out of the net. And I love that metaphor because I think, after George Floyd was murdered, we saw so many organizations step forward and say that they were part of the movement and want to be part of it. And I do think there was some genuineness there, but anybody who jumped into it because it was a trend, they are now leaving. And I don't think they are that helpful to the movement. If they see this as a trend and they don't see it as a justice issue and a mutual liberation issue, then I don't think they're very helpful. So I don't know if that answered the question, but that is my those are my current thoughts on DEI work.
Yes, we're keeping a close eye on that because, of course, what's happening in the U.S. and the kind of, I think, quite shameful rollbacks that have occurred there, and seeing whether they spill into Canada. And it's a very interesting perspective that you've brought, and I appreciate that point of view because that's I'm sure very very accurately describes the actual commitment that some of those folks, the dead fish, um, uh, uh, had in reality. Um, Women make up 70% of the nonprofit workforce, and yet they report significantly worse well being than men, apparently 39% versus 29% for men. What's behind this disparity? What kind of changes are needed to make nonprofit work sustainable and equitable for the women majority workforce?
That's a very good question. I think we'll need to dive deeper into the data. And that is part of our plan over the course of this year. So this is very much an initial findings report. And over the course of this next year, we want to sort of highlight specific topics and go deeper into them. Because in our data set, it's a representative data set, which means that it's sort of mapped onto the StatsCan numbers to see, who is represented. So oftentimes in surveys, groups that are overrepresented are retired folks, because obviously they're at home during the day and willing to answer a survey, and office workers, because they're sitting at a desk and willing to answer a survey. And so this survey was extremely hard to administer, because we have a very large cohort of frontline care workers and frontline nonprofit workers, so people who are entry level. So getting access to that group is really challenging, and trying to find that geographic spread. So I think what we'd like to do is dive deeper into that percentage of women who responded, because I think there's a few things. There's the breakdown of governmental nonprofits versus community nonprofits, because within the governmental nonprofits, we have universities, we have hospitals, we have the educational system. So a lot of those are unionized environments, and also highly regulated environments. So we need to see how those things play into these aspects, and then how that intersects with leadership. And then whether folks are entry level, mid-level, or senior leadership. So there's so many different factors. I would say that there's more to come, and I think this gender piece is going to be really interesting, because, as you said, the nonprofit sector is the community nonprofit sector is highly feminized.
Well, we look forward to hearing more about the insights that you hear and learn from your surveys with these frontline workers that, as you say, are usually the group that are most silent because you can't reach them. And so I'm fascinated with your findings, and I look forward to hearing more about your exploration into finding out about what their lives are like. To wrap things up, the report is rich with data, but how do we ensure that it leads to real change on the ground? Even though, of course, as you mentioned, it's just the initial report, it's the starting base. What are you most hopeful about in terms of how this report is being received and used by sector leaders and policymakers?
So I think the first thing is having the conversation. I think without data, we have our own experiences and we have anecdotal evidence. And I think those are very powerful, but they don't help us understand how big a problem something is, so the full scope of it. And then they also don't indicate which interventions could be effective. And then over time, is the problem bettering or worsening? And that's what I'm most excited about all of this, because I've worked in the nonprofit sector for over 20 years. And I feel like anecdotally, I knew a lot of these things. There's very little in this data that is surprising to me. But I am just thrilled to have this tool to be able to use it. So, I think it's great for nonprofits individually, because I think it validates their experience and it says, this isn't just you. It's not just because you're not running your organization properly, or you lost a funder, or your board's not as effective as it should be. Like, this is across Canada. This is happening. So I think it's really helpful for nonprofits. I think it's helpful for boards. I think boards sometimes struggle to know how to engage in the organizations that they serve. And I think this gives them a really strong talking point, to ask the executive director and the entire organization, are we paying living wages? Can we pay living wages? Can we have, a 3-year plan to be paying living wages? I think it's great for funders, because they can see the scale of the issue and they can think about that in their funding strategy. A lot of funders are very strategic and very thoughtful about their work. So I think that's helpful to them. And then for anybody who creates policy, I think there's 2 aspects here. I think there's, the piece around creating better policy, but also knowing that a lot of the money that they are flowing through to organizations is not enough. And they they need to change one part of the equation. They either support outcomes at a higher rate, or they request less in services. So I think there's a lot of information here. I think this is going to get richer and richer year over year. And that's what data does. It just helps us to solve problems in a better way.
Well, we look forward to learning more as you progress with this really important project. At Charity Village, we always look forward to the incredible insights on the sector that Future of Good offers in this important report on the well-being of some of Canada's most crucial workers that make up the sector and our society in general is so important. Thank you, Anouk, for the report's insights and your thoughtful advice for nonprofit leaders across Canada seeking to make meaningful improvements in working conditions for the change-making professionals in their organizations. Thank you for joining Charity Village Connects.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.